Brilliant. I'm seeing none. Move to item 3. I'm just going to make a very brief announcement here that there is going to be a consumer standards online training available on Monday, the 8th of December. So announcing primarily because it's very imminent. That'll be taking place at 6 p.m. This is something which members of Scrutiny will be invited to attend, given the role that the committee sometimes plays, particularly in overviewing the work of the Housing and Homelessness Working Group. So if members can try their best to attend, that will be really, really good. An invite will be circulated by email, but apologies for the short notice, hence the drawing it to people's notice at this stage. We'll now move to approving the minutes of the previous meeting. This was the meeting of the 11th of November, which was when we looked at the Hackney carriage emission standards. Are there any matters which members wish to see amended in those minutes? No, I shall take that as everyone is happy with those. We shall move on from that meeting. So we now move to addresses by the members of the public. By members of the public, I'm not aware of any. I'm also not aware of any councillor addresses. So we'll now move to item 7. Now, in the online work plan, this was posted as being, in the online agenda, this was posted as being the work plan. However, I'm going to propose that we reorder the agenda to take the substantive items first and do this with in the usual way with the administrative items towards the end of the meeting. Is everyone happy with that? Excellent. Thank you very much. In that case, we shall move to the Authority Monitoring Report and Infrastructure Funding Statement 24-25. And I invite Councillor Hollingsworth to come up to the front. Thank you. And I believe we've also got Lorraine Freeman, Miriam Salawu and Rachel Williams online as well. Whenever you're ready.
You whizzed through that so fast, my computer is not quite that quick, so it's just managing to open the agenda. Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation to come along. I have over the years brought a number of cabinet reports on the Authority Monitoring Report, the AMR in particular, the infrastructure funding statement, slightly more modern thing, so not so many. And I'm very aware that it will be down to Scrutiny to pick out elements rather than me. There are an awful lot of things in it. And so my inclination is always to go where you want to go rather than me try and steer you in a particular direction to look at things. There are clearly a range of data things in this, which I think are both reports, which are interesting and point in particular directions. I suspect one which will have grabbed people's attention is the change in the housing land supply figure, where the land supply itself has not changed. What has changed is our annual target, and this reduces the housing land availability from above 5 years to below 5 years. It was a consequence I think all of us knew wasn't possible, wasn't inevitable, of the local plan from June 2020 becoming 5 years old. Clearly, we know what happened with the last local plan, which was held up on a technical issue to do with housing need allocation calculations. We've looped back around that again, and there will be, as I'm sure you're aware, a new local plan, regulation 19, regulation 18, and we don't 18, yes, we have 18, 19 stage, which will be going through exactly this cycle very, very soon, I strongly suspect. The other thing I wanted to draw attention to, because I think it's important and it's often overlooked, in the infrastructure funding statement, this is where I apologise for not having this open quick enough to be able to get the page number out. But you will see in the covering report, so the report to Cabinet, a reference to this and the way that it excludes social housing from the calculation. And it does that because the infrastructure funding statement is essentially a cash flow account. So if cash, so a financial payment, has come from a developer to a local authority, then it is recorded. If what has happened is the transferal of, say, 40% of the houses on a big housing development, that does not count as cash, and therefore it is not counted. And so that creates this, I would say, distortion in the statistics. If we did not have any council housing here and it was just a straight cash transfer, then it would show up, because we and other authorities which have development we want to see on the site itself, which I think most authorities now do, then it doesn't show up as a transaction, which I think is an error. We can't say quite so crudely in the IFS, we think you're doing this wrong, because it's a statutory thing. But I wanted to draw that to attention of you, and I'm sure Rachel can add to that, and indeed Lorraine and Mariam. Sorry, I didn't realise there's all three. So I can see the faces above you. So I hope that is helpful. But as I said, I am completely under your control in terms of where you want to go as a meeting, and I will convey most answers over to the officers, who will have the technical information. But clearly, if there's anything where it's of a more small p or large p political thing, I'll step in if I need to.
Thank you very much. And yes, apologies for getting through things so quickly. In my speed, I forgot to remind everyone we are live streaming. So please do be reminded of that. I'll go for a first round of questions now. I'll go for an attempt to take 3 at a time, but obviously if they're very detailed, I'll go straight to answers. Yeah, please do. It's the music is making me want to go faster. Councillor Miles, you can have the first question.
Thank you. And I'm taking advantage that the cabinet member is also a lecturer on planning, so it's hopefully a good teacher. Right? So I'd just be interested. You referred to the statistic around the land supply of which is 2.88 years now rather than the 5 years, and just could you just clarify, very in layman's terms, what this actually means in practice, and then kind of connected to targets and housing. I understand that it's complex why we've not been meeting the targets, but there isn't a very, there's sort of a catch-all phrase that says there's a complex set of reasons which officers are starting to sort of understand why we've not met that. Would you be able to kind of expand on some of the factors that are meaning that we're not meeting the targets that we have set ourselves? So one is more of a technical, and then the second is around the actual targets and the complex reasons why we're not meeting what we're setting out.
Yeah, I think that would meet the definition of detailed enough to go.
Yes, I was going to say, if we could just pause there, because the second one of those in particular. So I think what I will do is I'll start by answering the first question. Officers can correct anything in that. And then the second one, because there are a complex, there was discussion about the wording of the cabinet report. I realise I'm looking at Rachel. I'm not sure she can see me looking at her. We exchanged emails over exactly this issue, so I think I'll then pass over to her. So on the land supply issue and why it's dropped from 5 point something to 2 point something, or 5.7, I think it was 2.8, and I have the page in front of me. In essence, what we've got is a housing target, which is in the local plan, the housing need figure. Sorry, that's a better way of putting it, a housing need figure. And in our local plan, the 2036 local plan, we identified that a very significant proportion of that cannot be met inside Oxford. And so that's why we have sites, so the site at Grenoble Road, for example, sites Begbrook, Yarnton, there's a number of sites which are meeting our unmet need for us. And so they're not in our local plan, we don't count them towards the data. So what that means is in the local plan, the housing need figure is essentially the figure that we can meet. So it's 10,880, whatever it is, divided by 20. And there's a staggering to it. What happens is once your local plan goes to 5 years old or more, you don't get to use your carefully calculated, the stuff that you can deliver. You go back to the straight, what's your need, whether you can meet it or not. So essentially, the need figure has more than doubled for this calculation. Clearly, it's the same figure. It's the way this particular sum is calculated, which other local authorities with plans that are more than 5 years old, but with unmet need outside their areas, have hit exactly the same problem. Once we get a new local plan adopted, then we'll go back to, I'm fairly sure, the housing need will be bigger than what that local plan will meet. The exact numbers will become clearer over the next few weeks. And then it will go through the planning hearings and all the rest of it. And then we will, I hope, go back to having the housing land supply, which will be considerably above 5. But until we get that new local plan, we're going to be in this position. We are not the only council. There are dozens and dozens of councils in this position. And if you look at other councils which actually do have the capacity to meet all, or supposed to have all the capacity in their own areas, they've got figures which are in some cases below 1. So Castle Point is, I think, the lowest, but officers can advise on that. But there are some very, very low numbers on meeting housing need. But for us, it's because of this oddity in the way the formula is calculated. It's not like we've suddenly lost loads of sites or gained masses of real need. It's just this way this calculation works. I shall be quiet at that point and hope that I got that correct, and pass over to officers for the second part of that question, which is this broad range of issues around delivery.
Yes, thank you. We obviously, when we were pulling the statistics together, we noticed that there was that downturn. So we have been trying to explore what might lie behind that. You can see in figure 1, the graph that's extracted from the AMR into the report, the covering report itself, that we've had a number of years where this number of housing completions is dropping. We've looked at what might be causing that. We explored whether we had a glut of planning permissions given in previous years that are yet to be built out. That doesn't seem to be the sole issue. We've looked at whether there's a problem with delivery on site. Members will be aware that there have been issues surrounding connections with Thames Water and so on. We don't necessarily think that's the issue either. Anecdotally, we know other councils are finding the same thing, and I'm afraid that the reason to use the phrase complex set of reasons is because we're unable to identify one reason in particular. I refer to figure 1, and I think you can see that there is a sort of cyclical element to this, and I'm inclined to think a lot of this is about cycles in the numbers of planning permissions and then the numbers of build outs that we're getting. You can see back in 1920 and 2021 significant levels of housing completions. And I'm inclined to think there's a sort of cyclical pattern to this. It might be linked to the economic downturn, it might be a result of tough market conditions, or it might be simply that a good number of permissions were granted some years ago and there are fewer of those remaining to be built out. I'm afraid it's a complex set of reasons probably, and not one single reason we can point to. But as it says in the report, officers are doing everything we can to identify where particular issues might be and to try and unpick those, to try and help deliver things, remove hurdles from the system to make sure that we can start to get those numbers back up in future years. I think that there's every reason to believe that will start to pick back up. But as I say, very difficult to pick out one or two particular reasons that's causing that at the moment.
Thank you very much. Councillor Rowley?
Thanks. A couple of questions, one hopefully very short, but I wonder if either Alex or officers could clarify why in 2021-22 and 22-23 half or nearly half the completions were affordable homes, whereas that figure is way down for the last two complete years. And I wonder if you could set out very briefly the reasons behind this. Secondly, are the figures in paragraph 26 correct? And is there something I'm missing? Because 3289 over 1087 is 3.02, not 2.88. Or does the housing figure rise year on year in the standard method? My apologies.
Thank you very much. I will try for one more question
Okay.
before going to answers this time, if that's okay. Is there anything else members wish to raise? Okay, Councillor Miles.
Yeah, it's just a follow-up on these list of complex reasons that you've given. Sorry, I'm looking at multiple screens, so apologies. But just wanted to understand, to what extent do you think, in your professional opinion, some of them are under our either direct control or influence? So is there anything that we could do differently as a council that might address some of the categories of issues that you have looked at versus other issues which we might have to be, as a council, lobbying central government on to address, or some might be just market forces. But, what's our direct control and influence over some of these complex factors? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go for a round of answers at that.
Okay, I'm going to do this in reverse. No, well, yes, I will do it in reverse order, I think. Because I think there's quite a lot on the complex questions. On the standard method calculation, I'm going to rely on somebody who doesn't have to keep taking their glasses on and off to see the numbers to confirm that the calculation is correct. It looked correct when I worked it out, but I hope somebody can double check that. On the complex decisions, I'm probably honest to explain the sort of the gist of my emails backwards and forwards with Rachel and the officers on this. My sort of starting point comment was, well, surely lots of this is down to Thames Water and the fact that, well, the Environment Agency block, which effectively blocked all development in Oxfordshire for a prolonged period. That's clearly going to have an impact. Actually, in Oxford's, the answer is and I'll let Rachel and the others fill in on this. Actually, as she said, rather less so than I'd anticipated. I'm sure other authorities in Oxfordshire and anywhere else affected by that Environment Agency, effectively, you cannot build any houses, even if you're in the middle of it and you've got planning permission. What you're supposed to do. That was a really serious issue, but it didn't necessarily directly impact on us. There are issues where process could be an issue. I'm not convinced they're very big on residential ones. But for example, we know that, and I'll let officers sort of fill in on this. We know that there have been issues with Section 106 is taking longer than we want. That's not necessarily a problem with us. It's quite often third parties who arrive late in the day. And then don't have a legal capacity. So I'm using an example, which wasn't a residential one, so it wouldn't show up in these, but it was a commercial application in my ward, near enough. It was right on the edge of my ward, so I became ward councillor for it. And there was a prolonged hold-up because there was supposed to be a technical highways-related Section 106. County Council Highways team had, I think, said what they wanted to do, but there just wasn't the capacity in their legal department to process it. So it just held up for absolutely ages. And then the applicant who wanted to be able to then bring in a developer to develop the site, they got the permission, they then wanted to market it. They're an investor and they couldn't do it. And that issue has arisen numerous times, and Oxfordshire is not the only place where this has happened. And so there might be processes like that which we can look at just to make sure. And we have, certainly I and officers have talked about trying to minimise hold-ups like that, which will involve saying to, if there's a third party, whether it's the Highways Authority or whether it's an Environment Agency, which or actually NHS can be very bad at this, arrive at the very last minute and say, oh, we fancy some Section 106 cash. Well, that's not fair on the planning authority. It's not fair on the applicant to arrive at the last second when they think they got permission and hold up everything with a claim that doesn't hold water. And so thinking about those kind of processes, I think quite an important issue. I think possibly the factor here, and this plays into the answer I was going to give to Councillor Rowley's one, is that maybe what we are looking at is a variation which is partly out of our control. We know COVID, that had an impact. We know that the inflation uplift, particularly in construction materials, which came from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there were very significant increases there, which, you know, just shifted something which looked like a viable scheme to an unviable scheme pretty quickly. And so that uncertainty, you know, you're not going to put and spend £1 million on getting planning permission for something you're not sure it's going to add up. You're going to wait until you think it's okay. Our numbers don't look great. You look at this, look at London as a whole in the terms where I think the number of housing units being built has dropped from 60,000 a year to virtually nothing in a small number of years, you know, and that's why the Mayor of London has made the policy changes he's made in order to try and address that issue, because that's clearly a serious concern. But that's a market problem as much as anything else. But what we might have is a lot of big sites got permission and they're being built, and that is the key factor, I think, in why the affordable housing percentages vary all over the place, is because the affordable housing policy, because this is the national policy, can only apply to a development site of 10 units or above. So if you had 100 sites and they're all 8 units, you won't have any affordable housing at all. And if you have one site of 1,000 units, you'll have 500 affordable housing units. And that's the difference. So basically what we've increasingly got is fewer and fewer large sites. So people often look at the affordable housing percentage and go, it's a shortfall by the council. It's not a shortfall by the council. It is because they are small sites, and so they will never, they cannot have affordable housing on them because they're under 10 units. And yeah, that's the main difference. So I would strongly suspect that is the driving factor of the variation. But I will be quiet now and hand over to officers to fill in and potentially correct any errors.
I think that's absolutely right about the point about large sites for affordable housing. We're reporting this year that, for example, 18 units were secured at Barton Park Phase 3. Now, clearly that's very much the tail end of the Barton Park development, and previous years, those 2 years that look much greater in the graph in terms of delivery of affordable housing, a lot of that will be down to earlier phases of Barton Park, of course. So yeah, that just underlines that point about large sites. If I can, on the standard method figures, the covering report tries to summarise a complex calculation that has been carried out and is within the authority monitoring report itself. So if I could refer to page 63 of the agenda pack, there's a table there that explains each stage of a complex calculation that works out that 5-year housing land supply. I have a cross-checked with the summary in the covering report, but I'd refer you to that calculation as set out in table 20 of the authority monitoring report. It is a complex calculation with a number of inputs. I'm convinced we've got the numbers right in that table, if not in the covering report. I think that's trying to do a summary of something too complex, I think. I'd leave it at that, I think. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Councillor Rotina, I believe you had a couple of questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a fairly basic question. I feel like I'm still learning. Can you explain what the difference between Section 106 and seal money is? In your table, it says seals allocated to different parish councils. How is it that some get none and some get more? Is that because that's where the development's taken place? And you say where they've spent the money, but don't some councillors get to spend seal if they don't have a parish council in their wards? That doesn't seem to be recorded where that money's gone. Should it be? And if the parish councils don't spend their seal, I'm thinking one that doesn't seem to spend any of it, how long do they have it for before it gets taken back from them?
Thank you very much. I will go for another question, Councillor T.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Alex, and officers for explaining the answer about the percentage of affordable housing. I just wonder if there are those restrictions where we just can't include or there's no requirement for the smaller units. Is there a way that we can separate those smaller units out in the presentation of the figures so that we can then look to see, okay, what is the actual what is where the council has control, so that we take out the ones where the council doesn't have that flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll go back to Councillor Hollingsworth at that because I could see the uncontained joy at Section 106 and Sill question.
It feels like I barely left work. So I will partially answer Councillor T's last question, and then I'm going to convey that one on to officers because I suspect where I'm heading is probably going to run into requirement issues. Mathematically, of course, it's possible. I think the issue is that the two documents have very strict regulations about exactly how they can be drafted, and that was my point about wanting to flag the on the infrastructure funding statement, this issue of, if there isn't a cash transfer for what are potentially by a mile the single biggest valuable Section 106 item, it looks like Oxford City Council is not achieving as much as this authority over here. Well, that's because we don't do a cash transfer for our. So I think the issue is we have to lay it out in a particular way so it's just the raw numbers. Would we be allowed? So I suspect the answer is no, we could not do that in the report itself. If we could do it in the covering report to help members of scrutiny committees, the cabinet, just note that there is a bit of a difference or there is a factor. I'm not sure. I think we could, and you will see some of the wording in the covering report is precisely that, to try and add some clarification. So I will pause there on that one and then let officers pick it up. On the difference between Section 106 and SIL. Right, and that's a long sequence of follow-ups, which are one of which I can't answer. Essentially, what Section 106 is, if there is a planning application which, as put forward, has some issue to it which would otherwise make it unacceptable, but which you can correct with a contribution to something. So, for example, building what did I say, 1,000-unit housing site or something like that, which is going to need a new junction off the road. And so you've got to pay for that new junction on the road and maybe a new school and various other things in order to make that an acceptable planning application. Then those are Section 106s. So basically a Section 106 is the financial funding of something which is a requirement for a planning application. So it is linked to that planning application. It's not some free budget that can be spent on other things. It has to be spent on the school that needs to be expanded or built, or the junction that needs to be provided, or the park that needs to be provided, whatever it is. So that's Section 106. SIL is kind of almost coming at it from the other side. It's all pretty much a tax on development, and it's based on square meters. And obviously there's different rates for different things. There is exemptions for householders and so on, but it will be X number of square meters of development. The SIL is Y number of pounds, X times Y equals this much developer needs to pay up. There are debates about between the two. The Section 106, it's very linked to specific things, and it must be being driven by what's unacceptable unless corrected, as it were, in a planning application. The downside of the SIL, or the upside is it's clear, the downside is you have to pay it on day one. So if and this is a really big issue for small, medium developers, basically means if you've got to fork out a wodge of cash on day one before you've even started work, then that is a massive disincentive. And there is a strong argument that it's a driving factor in seeing the shift of smaller and medium-sized developers away from being developers because can't afford it from a cash flow point of view. In terms of what you can then spend it on, the Section 106, as I said, has to be spent on the thing it's been raised for and nothing else. And if the council doesn't do it, so says, well, we say you've got to build a park and then decides to change its mind, you have to give the money back to the developer. If it is a SIL payment, then it has to be spent on the creation of new or the maintenance repair, as it were, on existing infrastructure, which is defined fairly broadly. So we as a council are able to give a small sum of that to councillors as a whole, individual councillors, to spend on things which are in their ward, as long as it is something that meets these fairly broad definitions of infrastructure repair. So it could be, mending the bench, getting the park sorted out, those kinds of things. The allocation to parish councils, there's two factors. One, the development needs to have happened in their area. So if you are Littlemore Parish Council, I suspect you're having quite a large chunk of this because there's a lot of developments in that area, the whole business park of things. So potentially that as a parish council is going to get a lot. Marston, there's big housing development, and so on. But, so it will vary from place to place. The other factor that will vary is the percentage is driven about whether you have a neighbourhood plan or not. So if you do have a neighbourhood plan, you get a bigger percentage as a parish council than if you haven't got one. And that's all laid down in national stats. In answer to if councillors don't spend it and will they have to give it up, that's way outside mine and our officers. Oh no, parish councils get it, that's it. Yeah, forever. Yeah, don't ever get it back. If individual councillors don't spend it, that will be down to the council budget making process, which is not my remit. Thank you. It's over to officers.
Hi, I think you covered quite a lot of that actually, Alex. If anything was missed, I'm not sure, but just to clarify, it's totally correct. Parish councils get 15% of any development payments we receive in from SIL for development in their area. And neighbourhood areas, those areas with a neighbourhood plan, we allocate 25% of anything developed in their area that we get SIL from. So 25% is kept for those, and they are notified of how much they've got each year, twice a year. Parish councillors, now those that are parish councillors that are not within a parish council area or a neighbourhood plan area, they do receive 2,500 of SIL, but this is it's done within the budget process, and I think there's £80,000 that gets taken from neighbourhood SIL and is given to the areas for councillors that are not within a neighbourhood plan area or a parish council. And I think there's something on our on the members webpage now that's just been put there to explain a little bit more about it, and the forms I think are coming online as well. Did that cover everything, or have I missed something?
Did you want to add something, Councillor?
I think you said parish when you meant city council, but I mean, I think
sorry, yes, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Everyone got that. What about the technical question from Councillor Latif about? It's more of a Rachel question, possibly. Can we continue to use the spirit of clarity, let's call it that? Shall we continue to use as much we can the spirit of clarity in the covering reports for things which we can't put into the actual reports themselves? And this was the suggestion about differentiating or showing the division, the split between units over 10 and under 10, because I think for a lot of urban areas like ours, it's a really important thing to be showing, because that's one of the biggest factors that changes the percentage of affordable housing.
Yeah, I'm happy to take suggestions on what we can do to add clarity to the data, whether that's takes place within the AMR itself next year or in the covering report. That'll be a judgment on how we can frame it, but more than happy to take that as a suggestion.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to Councillor Miles in just a second, but I had one very quick question I wanted to raise, which was just regarding Section 106. Obviously, we've clarified the difference between that and SIL. With the Section 106, does that have to be on council-owned land that the development would take place, or is it on land that the developer is proposing to develop?
It's universal, any development at all. And there are a range of things under Section 106, but yeah, I use the road junction. It's an obvious example. A school, if you're building a really big development, it's basically infrastructure which there isn't existing infrastructure to meet the need. You need to build some more. So it's essentially that. One could get into an interesting discussion about whether land value capture was a better model, but we are where we are.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. So Councillor Miles, Councillor Mundy and Councillor Stairs.
Thank you. And just actually one of the Section 106 examples in my ward was because there's a boarding house being built on a tennis court. The Section 106 states that the developer has to invest in tennis related leisure facilities on another site. So just as a practical example. So one of the questions, I've got two sort of areas of question. One is around this inconsistency of how SIL is allocated to councillors and councillors' role in deciding how, even if it's a small portion, gets spent. And just to give you a very practical example, so there's a neighbourhood forum in Summertown. I'm not allowed to play any role in the committee, although I'm on the steering committee, but I'm not allowed to have any input into any of the decisions of where any of the SIL gets spent because I'm a councillor. So that is the rule there. But as I understand it, councillors in other areas of the city get to actually direct and specifically make a decision about how they would like some money being spent. And it just seems, I recognise that there are these different structures that we're working with, but shouldn't there be sort of more of an equal decision-making role or lack of decision-making role that councillors play in this? Obviously, I can put an application into the neighbourhood forum and then they might choose to invest or spend the SIL in the idea that I've put forward. But actually, there is absolutely no guarantee. Whereas up to a specific value, if you're in a different area of the city, you can make that decision as a councillor yourself. So it doesn't seem fair, I think. So are there examples where then councillors do have more of an equal say and influence over how some of that, it doesn't have to be very much, but that SIL is being invested? And there's a second related question is around SIL. I understand that SIL allocation is under review, and so I'm interested in some of what criteria being applied for that review, but also very specifically, there is an unallocated amount of SIL. So given that SIL is decided for these cross-city projects, is decided during the budget round, what is the procedure by which we as either councillors or as full council can decide to allocate within any budget period any unallocated SIL, or do you have to wait until full council once a year to make sure a project's on the list? And a very practical example of that, the United Reformed Church in Summertown, which is a community asset, and they were trying to purchase it, and some SIL budget from the neighbourhood forum was spent on that. But since they had a shortfall, it would have been an ideal thing that any unallocated SIL was allocated to, but there was no process for us to follow other than wait until the next budget round. So that's the reason for my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think given the length of question, I'll come back to you, Councillor Mundy and Councillor Stairs, in just a minute. Councillor Hollingsworth, do you want to come?
Yeah, it's not what we're here for, because we have, as the planning officers, as the planning cabinet member, and indeed the cabinet, don't actually have any say at all. That will be it's a budget procedure. So I mean, what I would suggest is if Scrutiny as a committee decide to raise this issue, don't raise it with us because we can't do anything with it, but do convey it to would it be Councillor Turner, I guess, as the lead member for it, and things like that, and it would go through that way. Is it unfair? What we have and this is descriptive, is that where there is a allocation of the SIL to either a neighbourhood forum or equivalent thereof, because there is a neighbourhood plan but no parish council, or to a parish council, that's the body or equivalent of that it goes to. If there isn't one, rather than have that just entirely being spent by the city council collectively, the equivalent share is allocated to, as far as possible, other councillors. So the fact that you don't get a say is because you've got a neighbourhood plan covering your ward, whereas Councillor Latif does not have such a one, and therefore, were we to do it the other way round, he would have nothing and you would have something, and that would not be fair. So I think it is fair. But I'll let you ponder on that.
Thank you very much. I'll go back to Councillor Mundy and then Councillor Stairs.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for being late, and apologies, colleagues, for missing your introduction to the report. So I just wanted to refer to exemptions from paying SIL. Apologies if you have spoken about this in the report. I haven't heard you introduce it, but I have looked for it in the report on the agenda, and I've not seen it anywhere. I do know that in the financial year prior to this one, a fairly sizable exemption was made for the BMW plant, and I just wanted to know whether there'd been discretion applied in the last financial year that we have before us for any developments, how many times that was applied, and what level of SIL we effectively missed out on by applying that discretion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Stairs?
Thank you. Well, thank you for explaining the difference between SIL and 106. That's been very informative. Thank you very much. And you're right, Littlemore's earned a lot of money in the last few years, of which the parish takes 15%. But the 85% that the city take, is there a requirement for that to be used in Littlemore, or can that be used anywhere? I guess from my perspective, Littlemore's probably the poor relation of the city and has very little in the way of infrastructure. So they're feeling quite left out. So I just wondered what we might expect and what we might get from the SIL money, because our understanding is it will all go to the railway, which will not benefit Littlemore as such. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll go back to Councillor Hollingsworth.
Okay, the SIL exemptions, I'm going to go back to officers because I don't want to misstate on that one. Clearly, the BMW exemption is the only one that comes to mind, and I can't remember the timing of it, which is as exactly which year it fell into. So hence the question, or indeed what happened. On the bit that doesn't go to parish councils, and obviously if Littlemore gets its plan, it will jump from 15 to 25% if it gets the neighbourhood plan through the approval process. The rest then becomes a citywide scheme. So the SIL allocations are not something we decide, it's full council decides it because it's part of the budget process where the SIL money is spent. It's part of the capital programme, and if you look at the details in the capital programme, the annual capital programme, it will say, Lord knows what appendix you have to look at, but it's there somewhere. It will say this is the SIL element is spent on this and this. It will be on infrastructure things. Clearly, the railway, I mean, I don't want to, get into argument about it, but I think many people would see if a large lump of SIL was, for example, spent on a railway station in Littlemore, that would be seen as infrastructure in Littlemore, and potentially infrastructure which then generates further growth, which will then generate more money for Littlemore Parish Council. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about that, but in terms of the allocation process, it is in the annual budget process that you can see which bits are allocated from the SIL. I mean, there's obviously lots of different capital programme items, and some of them have to be identified as clearly funded by SIL. On the exemptions and the BMW, I am going to defer to officers to avoid saying anything incorrect because they will have more information than me.
You're correct, Alex, that the BMW is the only exceptional circumstances exemption that we've done so far. Other exemptions would be for charity relief, social housing and self-build. And there's quite a few of those that come through from time to time, but the only exceptional circumstances one is the BMW.
And sorry, the second half of the question I was writing down, which was the bit I definitely didn't know, was do we record the exemptions in the IFS, or is the IFS just on the expenditure end of things?
No, the IFS, this is regulation, so we only have to report, and basically it is just financial, and that's what we report on. We obviously do have a record of exemptions that we've given or granted, but we don't need to report it on them in this actual on the IFS.
Can I just confirm as well, the BMW exceptional circumstances is the only discretionary relief that we've offered to SIL in the entire time that we've had SIL. The other exemptions that Lorraine mentions, charities, social housing and self-build, those are all written into the regulations. So those applications are ineligible to pay SIL. So I'd frame those slightly differently, and we wouldn't necessarily keep a record of those because they were never SIL liable in the first place. So just to confirm, BMW is the only discretionary exemption, as it were, that we've granted ever in the 10 years plus of running SIL scheme.
So, yeah, just to make sure I've completely understood this correctly, because I think it's quite an interesting question, is that the IFS by statutory requirement is money as in cash we have received and allocated or spent or whatever. So the discretionary exemption would never appear in it by definition. And the AMR does not require us, well, it's not one of the things we have to produce. So we can't just stick in stuff we like into that. So basically what we've got here is two formal reports, neither of which we could put in a clause to this effect. So I think what we have, therefore, is the actual report that went to Cabinet and Council. Did it go to Council? I can't remember where it went. But we had an official formal report to arrive at the decision, and that's the record of it. So I think that is that correct, officers? Yes, that was correct, apparently.
Thank you very much. Any more questions which members wish to raise? Yeah, Councillor Miles.
Okay, so I recognise, I think it was on page 59, it mentions about the care homes, the fact that there's no care home accommodation that has come forward in the city. And I just want to sort of clarify your views on whether you think, given that we've got an ageing population and that we want more homes to be sort of freed up for as family homes, for instance, maybe in the city as well, should we be incentivizing developers, and can we even do that? To do we even know whether we have sufficient supply of care homes places within the city? And connected to this, I know that there are innovative models in the Netherlands that are being trialled where you've got cities that have high student populations. There have been sites that have been developed where there is co-housing between students and elderly people who have maybe lonely, need maybe a little bit of extra support. Is that something that we could be incentivizing in Oxford? Thank you.
That would be it's a local plan question, essentially, because we will assess the needs. And I'm going to go to officers just to confirm so they can double check. Sorry, I will do the double checking. They will tell you the facts as to what the current local plan and potentially the new local plan evidence is going to be a change as to allocating the need issue. In terms of incentivising, then clearly a council can incentivise something if it wishes by offering to subsidise it. The planning system is not appropriate for that. And in answer to your question, I think if I recollect correctly, some considerable years ago, as a planning committee, we had exactly a really innovative proposal to do exactly that, and passed it. And the academic institutions at college in question thought really long and hard about doing it, and I think ran into obstacles and in the end elected not to. But I think, and I'm fairly sure it would have been in your ward. So, but yes. The other bit, I think officers need to advise on the relevance in the local plan, current and future.
So I can confirm that we have done some work to look at the need for care homes in its various formats, because it's quite a varied. Well, housing for older persons comes in very varied forms. Care homes is one of those. So we've done a piece of work that looks, actually as a county council piece of work that looks at the need for homes for older persons specifically. We have that evidence base is up to date, and it is informing the policies of the new local plan. Those policies will come to scrutiny and then cabinet and council in the January cycle. We can discuss a bit more detail in those in that circumstance if that's helpful. Just broadly, there is not a huge demand for additional housing for older people in Oxford. It's not a huge pressure on our city, and we in the new local plan we will have a policy that is to the right proportion, the right amount. It's only a reference in the AMR because you can statistically count care home completions towards housing completions in terms of the land supply that we talked about earlier. So that's the reason there's a reference here, but it will be coming forward in the new local plan, which comes to your committee in January.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Councillor Stairs and then I have a question and I will look to the other side of the room.
Thank you. Very similar to Councillor Mars's question. It's about adapted properties and whether we're building any of those. I hear in Witney they're building quite a few bungalows and adapted bungalows, but that doesn't seem to be something that's happening here. I've got a resident who's been waiting a long time. He's now got to a point where he can't get in his bathroom, he can't get in his kitchen, and yet there seems no hope from what I'm hearing in helping him. So just wondering about how we're tackling that. Thank you.
I'm also just going to follow up with a question before we go to answers, which is around the proportion of students, specifically, obviously, in the report we've outlined, and thinking here particularly of pages 44, 45 and 46, the implication of policy H9 within the local plan. It mentions here that the university reporting dates don't quite line up with the reporting dates for this report. But I was just wondering to what extent there is communication, interim communication in effect with the universities in terms of expected student numbers, obviously in light of the current context of higher education and possibly further in light of the recent budget decisions. Universities are going to be under pressure to continue to expand effectively exponentially because there is a market pressure on them that it's basically do that or they will fold. So I guess to what extent is there communication with the universities? I completely support the principle here of allowing them to expand, but it would seem like it's going to become more and more difficult to meet that goal of having less students outside of student accommodation as we roll into the late 2020s and 2030s, given that the government doesn't seem to be changing tact on university policy. So I'd just be curious to know sort of what communication is there with universities. And we can see there's a reduction in students living outside, but is that a trend you'd expect to see continue heading into the new local plan period, or possibly reverse?
Right, so on Councillor Stairs' question, I'm going to ask officers to answer that because there's a specific policy in the current local plan and I'd like them to cite that, and I can't do it because I don't have it in front of me. Completely understand the issue and that flexibility about housing and the need for that, but there is a requirement. It's just, as I said, can't remember exactly what the numbers are, but there is a requirement for more adaptive properties that is part of the local plan now, and it doesn't seem likely one we will be changing in the incorrect direction in new local plans, put it that way. On the communication with universities, yes, yeah, obviously the there's very, very regular communication with both universities. I should stop at this point and say I need to declare an interest. I work for one of them. I like to say the one that is higher up a hill. Some people say it's newer, but anyway, Oxford Brookes is my employer. So yes, I mean, for example, we had long, deep, challenging, but in the end, productive conversations in the run up to the 2036 plan, thinking about how best to manage how students are considered. And I think, so in answer, the answer to your sort of basic question, communication, yes, there clearly is. Answer to the broader question that it raises is, how is this university change going to affect us in Oxford? I don't think we can be absolutely 100% sure. We look a little bit further ahead. These things are quite difficult to predict. The University of Oxford is, of course, globally important, and so its structures will stay, not dissimilar to what they are in terms of the attraction of their students. What I think was the biggest change that we made in the 2036 local plan was realizing that treating mature postgraduates who weren't in taught courses, but were here essentially working as researchers with their partner, with their children. Quite often, if you know where I have my allotment as the student university, there's the university flats opposite, and you can quite often see 3 generations living in there. And there is a fundamental difference, I think, between a taught course where people are here for 8 weeks of a year and people who are here for 3 or 4 years with their children. It doesn't seem to me that's not student in the sense of student, and that was the change we made in that policy. And that I think is quite important. And what I think changing the policy is not right, changing the data, what we were defining as a student. I think the thing that I can't predict is whether we will start to see, well, we're already seeing it in a lot of places, whether universities not dissimilar to Brookes start to look more and feel much more like an ordinary regional university, as you would see in Germany, as you would see in France, as you would see in the United States, where people don't cross from one side of the country to the other and then live in a student accommodation, but they go to their nearest university, which is teaching them courses which are based around professional skills and engagement. And it's quite interesting talking to would-be students and their parents. The thing that makes them most interested is, how is this connected to what happens next? My career, my job, whatever it might be. We might start seeing a shift, and that will have impacts like this. If you look at, say, a big American state university, yes, we're talking bigger geography, so some people will be resident in the city or wherever it is, but for a lot of people, they're there some of the time because they're tying down part-time jobs while doing their program. And I think we might start to see that evolve, and that was going to have different impacts. So this notion of a kind of like universities are going to look and feel like they did in the 1970s, not sure that's going to be true. What that means, therefore, quite difficult to predict. So, sorry. That was a kind of long non-answer.
No, I think it's a fair enough answer. I suppose I should also say my partner works at Oxford Brookes University, and I should have said that before, and I used to. But yes, I think it's a how long is a piece of string question, but it certainly will impact us and virtually every local authority in the country, given that universities are changing at the moment. Were there any more questions, members? Oh, apologies.
About the adaptive policies.
Please do come in. Apologies.
Yep. I could come back to that. So this is an area which overlaps with the building regulations, so building control area field. There is an option in national guidance for us to bring in locally an enhanced level of a requirement for an enhanced level of accessibility and adaptability. And we've done that in the local plan and we will continue to do that. So we do require 15% of houses on sites of 10 or more to have that enhanced level of adaptability or accessibility. I would say in Oxford, that doesn't necessarily mean a bungalow, because I think there's an argument that they're not necessarily the most efficient use of land, although in some cases, of course, it may well be bungalows. But that 10% of, 15% of development of on sites of 10 or more is required to have that enhanced level of accessibility, because there are benefits to a wide range of future residents that they have those features in place.
Thank you very much. Councillor Miles?
Yeah, just a still follow-on questions very, very quickly, and that's around biodiversity and nature as infrastructure. Can still be spent on enhancing biodiversity, thinking about that as infrastructure, which can be physical nature, but it is natural. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hines.
I am fairly sure that within reason, and therefore I'm not giving you a yes or a no, within reason, something which is enhancing of biodiversity can also be infrastructure. I mean, a fairly obvious one would be work on in a riverbank, or where there's damp areas and things like that. Actually, you'll get much better biodiversity and indeed much better infrastructure than a lump of concrete between you and the water if you've got something which is rather more creative. So I think within reason, but very good planning answer this. Each case needs to be considered on its own merits.
Thank you very much. Were there any other questions members wish to raise, or shall we move towards recommendations? Everyone seems content to move to recommendations at that. Were there any recommendations which members wish to propose? Yes, Councillor Lottie.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if colleagues might be happy to put forward a recommendation along the lines that around the affordability criteria to see allow the cabinet member but also officers to take away and see what's permitted, and if it's not permitted within the wider report, to include it in the covering report going forwards.
Thank you very much. I would be very happy to second that. I had made a note about doing so when you raised the question. Just in terms of wording, I presume what we might want to ask is, firstly, can they investigate what's allowed? And secondly, if it's not possible, can it be included in the covering documents for subsequent reports? Jonathan, does that seem clear enough for? That's always a good recommendation response. I presume everyone is happy with that and we don't need to. Yes. Thank you very much. Were there any other recommendations? Councillor Miles.
I wondered whether we should put forward a recommendation that when we're talking about the data point around not meeting the housing need and these the ratios that you were referring to before, whether we could just include some of these headings of the themes, which are the complex reasons. So not going into the full debate, but just as you had presented, Rachel, just looking at you here, you mentioned a few themes that sort of explain the complexity for why we've not been meeting our housing need. And I just wondered whether those topic areas could just be listed. Whilst not explained, it just gives a greater depth. And secondly, it was mentioned that there could be an issue with the section 106 taking longer than it possibly should, because of third parties' legal capacity. And I wonder whether we should, as scrutiny, request that an analysis is done on what can be done differently by the council to address this challenge with section 106 taking longer due to third party legal capacity.
Thank you. I definitely captured the second of those. I might ask you to go back over the first one because I didn't fully capture, and I don't know if Jonathan.
I go halfway through. So
yeah. So can we do those backwards for a second? So the second of those, section 106, basically we're asking, can officers investigate bottlenecks in that system, right? Yeah. I think, is everyone happy to support that as a recommendation? Yeah, thank you. Do you have that?
Yeah, I'll just tidy up so reflecting your comments.
All right, thank you. And Councillor Miles, did you want to repeat the first of the two you made? Because I didn't quite catch it, sorry.
Well, we were talking about housing land supply and the complexity in us as a council meeting our housing target. And there's a statement which refers to a complex set of reasons, and that wasn't explained in the current report. So the recommendation is that a sentence is added which states at a high level some of the themes which are the complex set of reasons behind us not meeting the housing need. I think there were a few topics that were mentioned, like, you know, building supply issues due to the, you know, sort of thing. Thank you.
I think just to try and broaden that, is the question here is where there are complex factors, can we just have a more thorough overview of what those are? It doesn't have to be long, but in a sentence or two. Was that the sort of the gist of things? More detail in the covering section, I guess.
So this is going to sound like an academic response to this. I think the point here is that we don't know. So that was why we chose that. Well, Rachel advised that word, and I agree with her, because we don't know. It's complex. Were we to list even a list of examples that are possible factors, that sounds as if we think it is those factors, and we have some evidence, and we don't have that evidence yet, and that's why we didn't do it. So I think I mean, by all means, put the recommendation in, but I think the answer will be no. Do you see what I mean? As opposed to the other one, which will say yes.
So, Chair, if I may, so just, I guess the point with this is it even feasible? So if it's not feasible, do we need to just be clearer that we just don't know, and because of the, you know?
Yeah, I can understand that. Maybe if we put the recommendation the other way, we recommend that the report be more explicit where the factors are not known to the council. Councillor Ottino.
Can we not similarly just ask the officers to explore those a bit more, like we did with the other recommendations? Is that possible?
I mean, in theory, we could. I do take Councillor Hollingsworth's point that it might be that it's basically indeterminate and impossible for the council to work out the answer. But I guess we could try and simplify this into one recommendation. We could say, can officers attempt to investigate to the maximum of their ability, and if something is unclear thereafter, please explicitly state that it's unclear. That would be maybe the best synthesis of those two. Would everyone be happy with that as a recommendation? Thank you. So that would give us 3 recommendations. Are there any other matters which members wish to raise? I'm seeing none. So I think all that remains here is to thank Councillor Hollingsworth and the officer team for your time and for coming along to join the wonderful party we're having tonight.
Very good vibes. And I think we should give a particular thanks to Mariam, who actually did most of the work on this and hasn't got the individual credit, and she should do.
Thank you very much. There was applause in the room, I feel I should tell.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we shall now move on to devolution, and I invite Councillor Brown and Mish to join us up here at the front. Councillor Brown, whenever you're ready, please do introduce the report.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I'm not competing with Super Trooper this time, but anyway, for those online, it's quite a different experience in the room. This is actually quite a sort of strange report, the more I think about it. Firstly, it came to council before scrutiny in cabinet, so that's already something quite unusual and strange. And secondly, it's asking for endorsement of a letter which is expressing an interest in something that is being written by another council. So that all sounds extremely vague and not terribly relevant. But of course, the point is that this is a really important letter. And if we are successful in expressing this interest to government, it will be the start of a process that will potentially lead to us having a mayoral strategic authority for the Thames Valley. So it is a very important moment, I think, it's not been without its difficulties to get us to this particular point in time, and I'm really pleased that we have got here. It's taken a lot of discussions, a lot of officer time, a lot of member time as well, to try and get to a point where we can move forward as a collection of authorities across the Thames Valley, with the exception of Buckinghamshire, who have decided that they still are not interested, although have been frequently checked with on this, to express an interest to government. The second point is there isn't actually a timetable to which we are fitting in currently, but that doesn't stop us from expressing an interest. And I think there is a possibility, at least, that there might be something coming in the next few months, who knows, from government about a timetable. So we want to be ready for it. And that's the critical thing, really, is that the kind of work starts here, really, if we get any kind of a nod from government. But I think that's probably all I want to say at the moment. I'm very happy to answer questions, and Mish has probably got much more detail that he could give to the whole affair.
Thank you very much. Did you want to add anything at this stage?
Just briefly, Chair, just to highlight a couple of things. Firstly, the linkage with local government reorganisation. Indeed, one of the sort of criteria on which the local government reorganisation proposals are measured are about how they work with devolution and how they support devolution. We think that our LGR proposal strongly interfaces, but frankly, any of the local government reorganisation outcomes, it'll be important from the point of view of the level of funding that can be achieved through devolution that happens. Another sort of perhaps obvious point to reinforce is that even the various sort of caveats that council leaders already highlighted, that this is an unusual thing. It is also not a decision point around devolution itself. So we will have an opportunity to actually look at the shape of any devolution proposal that came forwards. And then just sort of more generally, we sort of working closely with the Oxford Growth Commission. We're still sort of actively involved from the point of view of the Oxford to Cambridge corridor. And what we believe that devolution is sort of very much kind of, you know, going in the same direction as what those are seeking to achieve.
Thank you very much. I will now go to a round of questions. Anybody wishing to raise a question, please show. Councillor Ottino and then Councillor Latif.
Sort of wondering, how do we communicate this as being something that might be beneficial to us all? I mean, and also how do we sort of communicate that this is a place that we're part of? I've never described myself as being from the Thames Valley. Definitely didn't want one football team, which was a proposal at one point. Yeah, how do we sort of, I just imagine there'll be quite a lot of cynicism. It's just like another level of bureaucracy or something, and it'll be pretty, it'll feel quite distant from us. Obviously it's closer than Parliament, but yeah. I mean, if I was in London or Manchester, I think I'd probably feel really strongly about this, but like Thames Valley, I mean, I think Oxford's always been quite a hard place to define where it is in the country. Is it part of the South East, part of the Midlands, whatever? Is it part of the Cotswolds, whatever? I never really described myself as being part of the Thames Valley. Yes, it's just, how do we communicate it?
Thank you very much, Councillor Latif.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if Susan or Mish, whether we know, and whether, if we do know, whether we're at liberty to say why Buckinghamshire is not interested or not keen to proceed at this stage. And then the second thing I should say is, so I'm grateful to you for presenting the report. Conceptually, I don't know whether I have quite got my head around the two different concepts. Because obviously the local government reorganisation is pitched at a slightly smaller geographical footprint than the Thames Valley mayoral approach. And so I guess I'm just trying to conceptually understand the difference and how those two positions can be aligned. That we're saying, on the one hand, we think there should be a slightly smaller geographical footprint, and then on the other hand, we're saying, but actually, if there was a larger footprint, we'd be interested in that. I'm just, as I say, I don't know if it's just conceptually I'm struggling to understand that, but I'd be keen for your views and just help to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Councillor Jarvis for a final question, then for a round of answers.
Thank you, Chair, and forgive me if some of this was covered in your introduction and I missed it, but I guess partially in follow-up to Councillor Latif's question around Buckinghamshire, I guess my question really is about like what the sense we've got from government on this, because with local government reform, it's a quite a complex picture, right? They've got to make a decision around 3 different proposals, and maybe they'll come up with their own or whatever, whereas with this it seems pretty straightforward, which is there is a proposal, an expression of interest, which is essentially a proposal, one authority that's not interested, they don't want devolution islands, they're not going to essentially say, well, Buckinghamshire has a veto, so presumably it's a relatively straightforward situation we're in, and because there is almost unanimity that this is extremely likely to go ahead and is quite straightforward. Is that also your understanding?
Thank you very much. I'll go for answers.
Some very good questions there. So first of all, on communication, I think it probably won't surprise you, Simon, to hear that that's actually been a really big point of conversation amongst the local authorities involved in these discussions. You know, how do we present this to the public at large and indeed our own councillors to ensure that people understand what the purpose is here. And I think it's important to kind of go back to the first base, which is this was part of the government's manifesto, and it is about devolution. That is about devolving powers from central government to regional government, essentially, which is what we're talking here, to mayoral authorities. And so you will have seen in the budget that that mayoral authorities have done well in terms of long-term budget planning, powers, and so on. And frankly, that's what we as a collection of local authorities aspire to, is being able to have some of those powers locally that we would then be able to use. And, you know, that would cover all sorts of things from strategic planning to infrastructure planning to for instance, one of the things that's being mooted as well is things like a tourist tax. At the moment, that's being mooted and potentially sitting with mayoral authorities to potentially implement. I still think that would be better suited at a more local level, but you know, that's a different debate. So there are all sorts of things, and you mentioned Manchester, and obviously that is a really good example of where a mayoral authority does work extremely well. And you're also absolutely right to say that the Thames Valley is very different, but the government has made it clear that its long-term ambition is to have mayoral authorities across the whole country. So there will be, frankly, some pockets which are perhaps not quite such an obvious geographic fit, but nonetheless will have to kind of come together. I'm going to pick up the Buckinghamshire point next, because I think one of the critical things the government has also said is that there must be no areas left behind. So we can't have a sort of map which has just got kind of odd gaps on it. But Buckinghamshire has really been very clear that they don't want to get involved. And they are basically saying that partly because they already have a strategic authority, which was what they were as Buckinghamshire, which was part of a deal with the previous government. So there is less of an incentive for them to be part of this particular authority and to kind of come in with a mayor. But I think that there has to be sort of at some point a decision in government about what they're going to do about Buckinghamshire, whether they say that's fine, you can remain forevermore as a non-mayoral strategic authority, or, you know, actually you've got to go somewhere. And part of the devolution bill will give government the power to, I think, actually assign places to a particular authority. But I also understand that that is a power that government is really, really reluctant to use, because it's a fairly, it kind of rather goes against the grain of devolution, doesn't it, to sort of then say, but you've got to do it. So I think that it's not something that they're likely to want to rush into doing. So I think that's answered the Buckinghamshire question. And I think the final thing to sort of say from me is the differences between LGR and the Mayoral Strategic Authority. One of the critical things to understand about a mayoral strategic authority is it's not just the mayor, it's also the leaders of all of the councils that are within that area. And they together make up that authority and make decisions together. So it's really important from my perspective that we get the three unitary option through in terms of local government reorganisation, so that Oxford has its voice on that mayoral authority. Because if we don't, there will be either just two authorities for Oxfordshire, or even worse, only one authority for Oxfordshire. And that means that Oxfordshire will have very few voices on an authority that has, 5 or 6 voices from Berkshire and Swindon. And very critically, that the city would not have its own unique voice on that authority. So the two are connected. And I think they actually are very compatible, because it's about having local government, the place where, as close as we can possibly get it to where people live. And it's also about bringing powers down from government to a region that's sufficiently big and makes some geographical sense, so that we can all work together on those bigger, more strategic projects, infrastructure, transport, and sort of planning that makes sense at that sort of level.
Thank you very much. Mish, did you have anything to add?
Really, just to build slightly on that very last point on the scale question. So yes, we think that the two do work well together as a smaller place-based unitary authority, as the council leaders highlighted, but within a much larger strategic area, which can muster the resources and be able to sort of bring in significant investment, a large scale needed for big transport projects, skills development. They're also going to be taking strategic responsibility around environment as well. And one shouldn't lose sight of the fact that a number of the powers that currently sit with the upper tier authority in Oxfordshire, the county council, will effectively migrate upwards into this strategic authority. And one might argue that there'll be better resource to actually deliver them at that scale.
Thank you very much. Councillor Miles, I know you had a question.
Yeah, so it's a question about where does Swindon fit into the discussion, and I just like a bit of a summary of why they've been included. I have family in the West Country, and certainly Swindon seems to be very much sort of Wiltshire based. It's West Country town. It's where, the relationships all go towards Bath, Trowbridge, that direction. And it just, when you talk about things making geographical sense, centre of gravity, local identity, it just doesn't seem to fit from my view. But that's, just from someone that doesn't understand the rationale, but just knowing that wider region and identity. So just a rationale there, please. Thank you.
Yeah, please feel free to come in.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. Well, for a start, Swindon actually started this process off. So they were the ones that brought us together first of all to start talking about this. And they very much feel themselves as part of the Thames Valley. Interestingly, they are part of Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce. So as far as business is concerned, they're very much part of the Thames Valley. Brooks has a campus there, BMW have, plant there. So, there's huge connections between really important employers in our city and Swindon. But I think even if those connections weren't there, and I would say they are, and obviously we've got rail links as well, which are really important, including, actually direct rail links, hopefully more coming soon between Oxford, Swindon and Bristol. they very much don't see themselves as part of the West Country. They see themselves as sort of facing towards us, really, rather than facing towards a very rural sort of hinterland in the West Country. But also, incredibly importantly, from our perspective, they bring a lot to the party in terms of the Thames Valley Mayoral Authority. It makes our collective economy much, much stronger. To have them as part of the regional authority, or the mayoral authority, I should say, mayoral strategic authority. So it makes a much better economic case. And so for that reason alone, I think it would be worth doing. But actually, the connections are there, and the commuting between Oxford and Swindon in both directions, and Oxfordshire and Swindon, is, you know, quite considerable. So I think that there's a lot there that for us to build on, and they're a very strong, fast-growing economy that we as a city have been working with very closely for a very long time, as they're also part of fast growth cities with us. And then finally, I would say that although they are not considered part of the Oxford-Cambridge growth corridor, interestingly, they've had a lot of visits from Sir Patrick Vallance, who is kind of in charge of the corridor. And he, I think, very much does see them sort of as part of that extended corridor, which we always argued for, because we said they should be, because it is the logical sort of end of the corridor, if you like, at one end, just as we argued, by the way, for Norwich to be included at the other end, which is another fast-growing city that we have kind of close relationships with. So I think that there is a lot to be said for it. I also think that, you know, that will, I hope, find favour in government as well.
Thank you very much. Another round of questions? I did.
I'm not singing it.
I did have one thing just wanted to pick up, is obviously you've mentioned the role that the leaders would play in a prospective mayoral strategic authority. Could you just say a little bit more about what the likely, from what we know, governance arrangements would be, and how that would sort of sit with what we've proposed, or what was endorsed to go to government from the council in terms of the free unitary model? You know, is it the case in terms of how the leaders would operate that they would have a decision-making role, or would they only have an advisory role on your understanding of what government is proposing?
So that's kind of the next step. I mean, if depending, well, maybe not even depending on what sort of reaction we get from government, we are sort of going to start working on potential governance arrangements. And to some extent, to some great extent, I think, really, it will be for us to kind of come up with our own governance arrangements. Having said which, obviously, there are some kind of standard arrangements out there, and we can sort of look at what's already there. There's no need to kind of completely reinvent the wheel. But I think it can be a more collegiate model. And I think that is generally what we have been suggesting between ourselves that we would be wanting to look at. There will be some things that, under the sort of way that these devolution models work, the mayor would have a sort of deciding vote. So there are some things on which the mayor has to agree. So in other words, I think people can't outvote the mayor. But equally, the mayor can't simply impose decisions on the mayoral authority in the face of huge opposition. So generally speaking, I think it's about working together and compromise. And I think that the process that we have been through in order to get to this point has been a good process in terms of teaching all of us as authorities on how to do that. So yeah, Mish, you've probably got much more detail on potential devolution models, but yeah.
Well, so there's one question around the weighting of votes. Again, that's absolutely something which, as Councillor Luder said, would have to be discussed at the next steps. It's not automatically the case that all the members of the mayoral strategic authority would have the equal level of vote, because if you've got very different size authorities. And then there is, just sort of adding to that point, that there are some matters which would require mayoral support to be able to be approved. Equally, there are other matters which if they are to be locally introduced, transport schemes is one of those sort of classic areas, it would also have to have the agreement of the specific local authority. So it couldn't be imposed by the mayoral strategic authority on that local authority area.
Thank you very much. I'll come to Councillor Latif, then Councillor Stairs.
Thank you, Chair. I think Mish has actually answered part of my question, which was going to be, I think, in Councillor Brown's original answer to me. It was just a follow-on, is to say, actually having 3 voices for Oxfordshire is better than 1. But as you said, Mish, and that's the point I was going to raise, presumably there'd be some sort of proportionality so that it's not 3 equal voices. Each individual voice is diluted a little bit. I guess at this stage we don't know which way that's going to be, but that actually having 1 large Oxfordshire voice might not necessarily be a disadvantage.
I'll go to Councillor Stairs and then come for an answer. Councillor Stairs.
Okay, hope this is not a silly question. ODS is one of Oxford's success stories, which maybe the other councils don't have. So would we lose that benefit that we have with that?
Thank you. Please do come in.
So let me take Councillor Stairs' question first. So this has no effect at all, the mayoral strategic authority, on how we run our services as a local council. If your question was more about local government reorganisation, I think that we'd obviously have to wait and see, and I would certainly hope not. And in fact, the other councils have all expressed an interest in our model. So I would want to reassure ODS employees that whatever the outcome, I would expect that people would want to be supporting a very successful company. But we obviously think that their future is strongest with a Greater Oxford. In answer to Amar's question, or I think it was more of a statement really, but anyway, I'll make it into a question. So on this weighting issue, I mean, that is true, but I mean, if you're in a room with, let's say, 5 council leaders there from Berkshire, and 1 from Oxfordshire and a mayor, most of the time it doesn't get to a vote. It's about the conversations you're having in the room. So the kind of weighting of votes, I think, is a pretty weak place to be. But also, more importantly, from my perspective, the issue would remain that if you had a unitary Oxfordshire, Oxford simply wouldn't have a voice. So Oxford would be 20% of Oxfordshire as a whole, and the leader of Oxfordshire, who would be there representing Oxford as well as all of its other interests, would be far more interested in representing the rural majority of the county than Oxford City itself. So it's not just about the kind of weight of the vote, it's about the quality of representing the place. And I think that's the real difficulty with, as I see it, having a single unitary authority. But we're not supposed to be talking about unitarisation. We are supposed to be talking about mayoral authorities. But as Mish said right at the beginning, the two are connected because it is important, because the leader of whatever councils that we end up with in Oxfordshire will be potentially on this authority. So there absolutely is a connection, but it's not quite where we're at today.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Mish? I've got one more question, Jared. Obviously, when we're thinking about the devolution process, would it be possible, and I appreciate this is already out there, but for you to just outline some of the powers that would be likely to come in as a result of the devolution process? So, I noted a couple of things in the budget. We've also talked about some things going up, but just in a loose outline, what kinds of powers are we talking about? I feel like it'd be useful to have more of a sense of that.
So strategic planning is perhaps the most obvious one to highlight. There was, as I think all councillors will be aware, a strategic plan for Oxfordshire that had been in development to take us to 2050, and then that was shelved because there wasn't a sort of full agreement among all the councils. The mayoral strategic authority will have responsibility for the oversight of development and oversight of such a strategic plan. It will have be involved in setting targets around housing numbers. It will take overall responsibility for environmental sustainability planning. So essentially the kind of longer term strategic level environmental work rather than sort of delivery of individual projects. Transport we talked about, and again, that's more at the strategic level. So it's not about highways maintenance; it's about planning large schemes or sort of significant changes. Skills is another area which currently sits since Oxlep was wound up, that currently sits with the County Council, but that would move up to a larger level. And actually, if you look at skills anyway, organisations like Activate Learning are operating across a wider geography than just Oxfordshire as it is, and inward investment. And so it sort of, I guess, gives a more obvious face to attracting inward investment from other sort of, well, from private sector and other countries indeed into our geography.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Yeah.
I was just going to, I mean, I don't think Mish has missed anything, but I do think that last one's really important because actually I think it's as much about the soft power of getting that inward investment when you're sort of representing an area which has got quite a varied potential investment portfolio, if I could put it that way, that I think is as important as anything. And certainly if I talk to the leader of Greater Manchester Council, she spends, you know, actually quite a bit of time effectively acting on behalf of the strategic authority, getting that inward investment into Manchester. And you know, she's not necessarily getting it into Manchester, she's getting it into Salford or Oldham, but that's because she's acting on behalf of the whole of the authority. So there's a lot of potential, I think, to get a lot of investment, which would be really beneficial to our local economy.
Thank you. Were there any further questions members wish to raise? I am seeing none. In that case, we can move towards recommendations. I think it's worth being aware that it would be very hard for us to make any particular recommendations on this report, but would anybody like to endeavour? In that case, I think it falls to us to thank you very, very much for your time, Mish and Susan, much appreciated, and thank you for the information as well. It's very interesting to hear about the process. Thank you. So we will now move to the more administrative components. This includes the scrutiny work plan. You'll have seen the work plan circulated. Is there anything anyone wish to note regarding the work plan? Any questions? I'm seeing none. Celeste, I think we had one thing we wanted to raise here and it's eluding me. Could you possibly drop in? Yes, please.
Oh, yes, of course, Chair. I believe there was a request for fair trade to be looked at by scrutiny, which had come from a member of the public. Just to also share that this request had also been received in the previous years. And again, this is included in our long list of suggested topics. And whilst it wasn't quite possible to bring it yet during the time that it was requested or during those multiple times that it was requested, we're still continuing to monitor this particular topic, especially given that the small business champion role had been revived by Councillor Monkonge. We'll continue to look at this potentially in the near future and bring it to scrutiny if that is if there's a feasibility in that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for covering that. lost sight of it in light of the amount of other questions we've had tonight. But that's great. Were there any other questions people had about the work plan? We all happy to approve the work plan? Thank you very much. The one thing I would note is that on the 13th of January, we have the next round of the local plan, just to make sure members are aware ahead of time. We now move to consider cabinet responses, and we will be asked to note those responses. So this is regarding firstly, the meeting on the 10th of November, where we considered the LGR. During this meeting, we made one recommendation, which was accepted. We then also had the meeting of the 19th of November, which was the licensing. Was that the 19th? I believe that was the 11th. We've got here written the 19th, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I believe it was the 11th.
Yeah, it was the 11th, sorry, miswritten date. The 11th of November, which was concerning the Hackney carriage license, emission standards. One of our two recommendations there was accepted. That was the point around making sure that an end date was added once the outcome of LGR was taken. The point around basically pulling in compliance between Hackney carriages and private hire was not taken forward on the basis that Cabinet felt it was not appropriate to enter into further regulatory arrangements in light of the first point around the LGR. Those were the responses. Obviously, does anybody have any comments or thoughts they wish to raise about that? Councillor.
Are we able to recommend those to the licensing committee? Because it's obviously going to be the licensing committee that's going to.
I don't think there's a mechanism for us to directly make recommendations to the licensing committee. I will just check with officers that that is the case.
So there's not a formal mechanism to take it to licensing committee. However, we could take those comments and pass them on to officers so they are aware the next time the policy would be coming through to a committee. But yeah, we can definitely pass them on to officers.
Thank you. I think in the circumstances, that probably sounds like the best we can do. And thank you very much for taking that forward. So we will pass on the comment that we would have liked to have seen this, and the licensing committee can pick that up should they so choose. We then have reports back on working group recommendations. Just to note, there is one element of this that is an exempt item. So if anyone wished to raise questions about it, that would require us to go into closed session. That would be in relation to the shareholders group, if that's right, isn't it, Celeste? Thank you. So I will now pass over to Celeste for a brief update on the activities of the working groups.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So in this period, all of our working groups did meet in 3 separate occasions. So firstly, the Housing and Homelessness Working Group, they met on the 13th of November. Apologies if I got the dates wrong. It's been a long November. They did consider 4 substantive items. There were no recommendations that were agreed, but there are summaries of discussions and points that were raised around those reports, which are housing compliant handling performance report, building safety and compliance performance, a cabinet report, which was the draft resident involvement strategy, and a decarbonization update. Just to touch on what was discussed, pardon me, Chair. So in regards to building and safety, a point was raised on the subcontracted fire risk, which was also a point that was picked up by the Audit and Governance Committee. So the fire risk assessor is not appearing basically on the professional register. That was a clarification that was given to members then. And the members were also reassured that there is now an internal fire assessment team that's been established within the council. In terms of the draft resident involvement strategy, there's generally a positive reception of this report, and the working group was quite welcoming of the opportunity to track the strategy's intentions and be part of that feedback loop in that tenant board that's being established. I suppose that is it for me in terms of housing and homelessness. I don't know, Chair, if you would like me to carry on with the rest, or if you want to go back to some members.
You'd be happy to go through all of them, and then we can ask for questions in the round and comments in the round, if that's okay with everyone.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of Climate and Environment Group, they did meet, I believe that is on the 17th of November. They considered an update on the net tracker, but as well a draft air quality action plan and the biodiversity strategy and Environment Act update. So on the air quality action plan, whilst they were considering this was also out for publication, which was quite helpful in terms of feeding back on this particular plan that is proposed. Some of the points that were raised were the effects of, for example, county level policies like the congestion charge, some potential inconsistencies between administration and whether these different positions were acknowledged in the document, and particularly in the context of the local government reorganization. In terms of the biodiversity strategy, the working group was celebrated the new posts, the two new additions to our council, the ecologists, and one of the main points that were raised in the discussions were the resources that are benefited to them to be able to meet their duties and requirements of the council in terms of the biodiversity work. With that, there is a recommendation that was agreed, and that is the engagement of the communities and voluntary groups, drawing on their expertise to support the delivery of the biodiversity strategy, and to actively inform. The second part of that recommendation is to actively inform the public about the criteria for good habitat, and that's to clearly promote what good biodiverse habitat looks like, so that the public understanding can be strengthened. Chair, and the last one would be the Finance and Performance Panel or Working Group, which had met on the 26th of November. The cabinet report that they considered was the Treasury Management Annual Report. There were no recommendations on that particular item, but on the company's side, there are two appendices in front of you, which are, as you rightfully mentioned, are exempt, and those recommendations are set out in those supplied appendices. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Would any member of the committee like to raise any questions or comments regarding those items? I know we have several members of the working groups present, so if any of you would like to raise anything on those meetings, please feel free. If everyone is happy, then I think we will just propose that we endorse those recommendations. As a reminder, given most of us weren't present at the various meetings, we can't change them, we can only really endorse them or not. Is everyone happy to endorse the recommendations of the working group? I see that as unanimous. So I think we can consider those endorsed. The last thing that remains is to give the date of the next meeting, which will be next year, on the 13th of January. We will be discussing at that point, I believe, the local plan. So I look forward to seeing you all for that on the 13th of January. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope everyone has a nice evening.